The increased awareness of mental health issues following the coronavirus pandemic is not unlike the awareness that came with the world wars of the 20th century. The main argument of the article, written by Lee Norton, is that while it might seem to be in the 21st century that we experience a far greater wealth of knowledge about mental health and the origins and impact of mental illness than those who lived in the early 20th century, we in fact see that a great amount of our understanding regarding mental health began to take shape in the aftermath of the First and Second World Wars. My research has shown that the psychological effects of the First and Second World Wars have been integral to the development of a less stigmatized and increasingly cohesive understanding of mental health within Europe, which forms the basis of current 21st century practices and attitudes towards mental illnesses and disorders. This was especially true following the First World War. Servicemen, particularly those from the front lines, were returning to their homes with shell shock, PTSD, and often irreversible injuries that caused evident behavioural changes. The enormous amounts of men returning with such changes to their behaviours demonstrated to many for the first time that mental illnesses were not so much a result of, as Greg Effigan puts it, weak character, but a manifestation of genuine disease. The idea that weak character caused mental illnesses was no longer a generalisable explanation, as many of these men who were reasonably healthy before the war were now coming back in droves, almost all of them psychologically damaged to some degree. Mental illnesses could not be treated on the front line, and so many men were forced to evacuate the trenches and return home. In their book listed on the slide, Helmus and Glenn argue that coupled with the expectation of evacuation, symptoms of war neurosis, the alternative name for shell shock, were reinforced and ingrained in the wounded soldier's mind, and that those who remained in Great Britain often demonstrated a long-standing disability. Indeed, Greg Effigan also states that in Germany, more than 600,000 servicemen were treated in military hospitals for nervous diseases in the years 1914 to 1918. Because the explanation of a weak character could no longer stand, and because these mental illnesses expressed themselves as long-standing disabilities, they were regarded as more serious. As Norton's article states, often newspapers of the time shed light on the practices and attitudes towards mental illness. A newspaper from 1941 expressed the views of Ernest Brown, the Minister of Health, where he stated that there is no clear line of demarcation between mental illness and physical illness, and that modern conception calls for the eradication of old established prejudices and a complete revision of attitude of society regarding its duty to the mentally afflicted. However, this understanding of mental illnesses has often been undermined and belittled to fit the narrative that 21st century advancements in science put us above our ancestors, who have often been depicted as barbaric when it came to treating mental illnesses. For example, electroshock therapy, which is actually still used today. Importantly, though, stigma around mental illnesses began to break down following the two world wars, thus being one of its most crucial contributions to the development of attitudes towards mental health, which we still benefit from. For example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which you can see on the screen, which was established in 1952 to help categorize, diagnose, and break down stigmas around mental illnesses following the world wars, which is still in use and is consistently updated with the newest information, the newest being the 2013 version. But why was it that the two world wars of the 20th century changed perspective on mental health? Why was the stigma forced to begin breaking down? The reason for this was that it involved mentally stable men going to war and returning with poor mental health. Historically, mental illness has been associated with women and feminine qualities. In fact, Helmus and Glenn state that during the First World War, it was believed that only women and not men suffered from psychological disorders. Indeed, sometimes soldiers who presented only psychological symptoms of a mental illness were treated in a disciplinary manner and in a number of cases sentenced to execution. However, attitudes began to change when this gendered notion of mental health was brought into question. Hysteria, for instance, was considered a strictly female mental disorder by the early 20th century. According to Effigan, by the final year of World War I, 5% of all hospital beds in Germany were reserved for hysteria cases. However, as mentioned in Norton's article, mental illness was discussed more openly in the media by the late 1930s. it was still heavily gendered. Male suicides were depicted as being concerned with money. For example, in Bournemouth, the Daily Mail reported a suicide caused by worry over foreign bonds. Female suicides, however, were often depicted as being in response to domestic affairs. An inability to endure parting was deemed the reason for a woman's suicide in Shaldon. While discussions around men and mental illness have increased in the 21st century, this does not necessarily mean that men are coming forward, are getting help for their issues any more than they were 100 years ago. Women on average are diagnosed with mental illnesses more than men, but this is more so the result of stigma preventing men from getting help. Indeed, anxiety and depressive disorders are typically viewed as female problems, which women might be better to cope with by accepting help from others. But alternatively, unwillingness to report anxiety may mean that among young men who do report it, the condition is more severe. These unspoken gender divides have persisted even throughout our supposed mental health enlightenment in recent years. In moving forward, the wartime roots of modern mental health knowledge cannot be ignored, especially in light of the special circumstances that we currently live in. This time will no doubt also inspire change and a re-evaluation of what we currently think we know about mental health. Thank you for listening.